Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Gulsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. Hold on, let me move my sticky note off the screen so I can see you guys.
Let's do a count on how many times I swat at bugs.
Yeah. Marcus, I feel like we always say at the start of an episode that this is going to be a good one, but I think it's because we enjoy this so much, and everything we talk about is inherently stuff that we enjoy. And we're here today with Jason Snavely from Drop-Tine Consulting. I think Jason, you have a podcast too by the same name or similar name?
Drop-Tine Podcast. Yep.
Yeah, and we want to continue this conversation that we started recently with Dr. Bronson Strickland from Mississippi State about regenerative ag. And, the three of us have been talking a little bit offline before we got this thing rolling, and I think there's going to be some really interesting discussion today. And I know, Marcus, based on, some of the feedback that we got, there were a lot of listeners that felt like our first conversation around regen ag maybe fell a little bit short, or we didn't get to everything that we should have discussed.
Yeah, I got that impression also based on several comments through various mechanisms. I got the impression that people thought we were, negative towards regenerative agriculture, or not dismissive, but that maybe skepticism. They were hearing skepticism.
I think maybe they sensed our ineptitude when it came to discussing the topic.
Yeah. Well, I think some of that was warranted, and some of it may be misplaced. I have since gone through a lot of literature on this topic and tried to get up to speed. One of the things that was pretty shocking to me when I was doing that is I found one paper, and Jason, I think you're familiar, but we generally, any paper we talk about, we link it in the show notes, so this one will be linked. But I found one that was just tracking interest in this topic in the peer-reviewed science, cross disciplines, and I found it pretty remarkable that the interest that's been given to regenerative agriculture, just that search term and group and all the different things that could mean across different disciplines, basically went exponential at about 2015. But even in that paper and a couple of other ones I found, they say something along the lines of what you said, Jason, that a lot of these techniques have been practiced for a long time and sometimes never have stopped being practiced in some parts of the world.
Right.
But a lot of this stuff has been around, and some of these ideas has been around for decades, if not longer. And, it's just there's been this strong resurgence in interest of the topic area. And that seems pretty evident when you look at the Web of Science, where we kind of track publications on topics. But we went from, basically less than 10 papers a year through the 2000s up to hundreds every year in the past several years. Wow. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah. And there's some really good stuff out there going on right now, obviously, with all that popularity. But yeah, guys, I appreciate you having me today. I'm absolutely honored. I'm a huge fan of both of you and the work that you guys do. Welcome to Drop-Tine Farms. I personally, I'm a field guy. I like being in the field. I don't learn in the office anymore. So I'm set up out here in a fall reload plot. I figured it would be a good illustration. No green screens needed, but
yeah, you've got some good background music going on there, some sound effects.
And if you see me swatting, there's so many bugs and stuff in this, and birds. And for those listeners who can identify some of the birds and stuff, they get a they get a bonus hat or T-shirt or something. Unfortunately, my township decided to mow one of the roads out here today, so you may hear that too.
Okay.
Uh,
Okay.
the
So
mowing.
so you're based out of Pennsylvania, right?
So my farm's in Pennsylvania, yes, sir. I
Okay.
don't spend, unfortunately, I don't spend as much time here as I want to because of the nature of my job. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so I'm going to jump in there and say I listen to the podcast, guys, because I'm a big fan, and I was on an airplane and I was taking a bunch of notes, and there were some observations because I try to become a keen observer of things as I get older. And there were some observations that I made. I wasn't watching it, obviously. I was only listening to it, which I prefer. But one of the things that I thought that I already shared with Will and Marcus before the recording, that I thought was really intriguing, is I always say that the best tool that you can start with in this type of biomimicry or farming or food plotting in nature's image or regenerative agriculture, whatever you want to call it, is by changing your mindset and adjusting the 5 inches between your ears. And that's why I liked it so much. Um, and let's just get started with one of the first things that I made notes about, which is this term regenerative. And Marcus, you've sort of hit on that. It's a good thing that it's a popular term and that this movement has become so popular with the help of people like Gabe Brown and Ray Archuleta and Rick Haney. But I think, a lot of times, sort of like organic, these terms get greenwashed. And you're seeing a massive greenwashing of this term regenerative right now. So I like to, there's nothing wrong with the word. I have some peers in the agricultural world who absolutely despise the word. Obviously, our context is completely different here in the wildlife arena. But I think we have to be very careful about placing a wrapper on what regenerative is and defining. I don't like terms like that or definitions or brands or labels really on anything in nature. This is really just biomimicry. This is food plotting in nature's image, and let's just keep it at that. So I think, when it comes to regenerative, the regenerative agriculture movement um, has been fascinating. But if you're on the front end and you're ingrained with some of the consultants in that industry, they're already starting to see, I don't want to say a pullback, but they're starting to maybe self-correct that, hey, I don't know that regenerative means completely eliminating herbicides or completely eliminating tillage, right? I am, but by no means, before I get all the nasty grams, by no means am I promoting tillage or herbicides. They've been removed from my farm. If I felt that I needed that tool to restore ecosystem function, and I had observations that led me to believe that, and then I bounced them off of smarter people like you guys, I would absolutely pull out any of those tools. But I just want people to understand that there are production agriculturalists out there, producers, farmers, growers, who are using the roller crimper to create a weed suppression mat. But then they're also going in after because they didn't get 100% termination, and they're spraying a herbicide to make sure they terminate it prior to their next crop. Now, this is where that term context comes in for me, because we are not producing massive yield here. We're not feeding the family based on what you see behind me. I have one goal, and that's to restore ecosystem function. That ultimate goal goes to, my kids want to kill big, healthy, mature bucks. And we want to restore turkey habitat, which is one of my massive concerns here on my farm over the last 17 years. So I think context is important. I think it's important not to place labels on something. Bronson and those guys came up with this purist, this regenerative purist, I think because of me. I love the project. Luke is a super talented individual, super smart. Obviously, being a graduate of MSU, I'm so glad that they decided to go down this path, and we're going to learn so much from what they do.
Yeah, I think to speak to that a little bit, one of the things that science is really good at is isolating single factors and, conducting experimentation to learn how changing, one or maybe sometimes two factors at a time influences, the objective, the results, whatever it is we're trying to get to in any given study. Um, it does not, incorporate a holistic perspective as well, but the goal is hopefully like once you understand how factors work individually and the mechanisms there, then you can start to combine those together. And unfortunately, sometimes that's just a really time intensive process, right? So, I mean, I think that there's maybe some of those things that you're seeing that'll eventually be backed by science, but it just,
Hmm.
sometimes, especially like with turkey ecology, we get frustrated all the time how long it's going to take us to get there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I can add in on that because we're in this situation all the time as scientists where we have what is known. I'll put that in quotes uh, by the observers, and then what is known in quotes based on what the science says, and they often don't align. And digging into the turkey literature, we've been pretty frustrated, like Will has said, about this. But my immediate reaction to that is, why do they not align? And I think sometimes it's because it's difficult to capture in an elegant research study, but it is equally uh, evident that sometimes what is observed is not actually being observed. And I think I would be remiss not to say that as a scientist, that I mean, how many things will have been the common knowledge about turkeys
Right.
forever, and then we find out, wow, we were completely wrong, and sometimes it led us down a really poor path,
Hmm.
and then we find out later, man, we really should have been doing something different than that.
So
And
when I was at Mississippi State, Dr. George Hurst was one of my professors, and I worked on some projects for his graduate students. And I remember I always got a kick out of George because he just, he would just throw it. He didn't, didn't hold back. He just told you what he thought.
mm,
And I have huge passion for wild turkeys. I think, when I was there, I was 100% committed. I wanted to teach. I wanted to get my master's, and I wanted to get my PhD because I wanted to teach the things that I love. And
mm,
I thank God every day that I did not go that route. That I went this route only because
good for you.
I still get to teach, right?
Yeah.
And I get to teach my way. One day I'm in Oklahoma, and the next day I'm in New York or Kansas or whatever, and I'm learning, right? We're all
Hmm.
learning, and the scientific method begins with making an observation.
Hmm.
And you'll see me looking at things from time to time because there's insects jumping all over the place, and I often wonder. I take Brix reading with my refractometer. Was out here yesterday doing that. Why did that grasshopper jump on that leaf, take one or two nibbles, and jump, right? And it's because that plant was healthy, and healthy plants, are not attractive to pest insects. It's just a fact.
Hmm.
When I was at Mississippi State, we had to give that senior project and presentation. It was kind of preparing us for grad school. And I remember Mike Chamberlain at the time, who's now become massively famous, right? Mike Chamberlain at
Hmm.
the time at Mississippi State sat on the panel, and he was hammering us with questions. And nowadays, I feel like people, A, they don't question enough, and B, they don't know how to question, right? I mean, there was some research I was reading, I just presented at a talk in Springfield where I forget the average, 4-year-old, 5-year-old girl asks like 390 questions of her mom. I think it was done in Great Britain or somewhere, of her mom every day. And then by the time like she was 5 or 6, it declined dramatically. And that's because we're kind of told and taught in grade school not to question things, not to ask questions. And that's what I like about science and about you guys is you're on the cutting edge. I mean, you guys are on the leading edge, you're asking questions and you're figuring it out. But I think where the beauty lies is when multiple disciplines, guys like you, gals like, in your position, come together with people like me and we just brainstorm. I mean, I was telling
Mm-hmm.
you before you hit record, one of the things I noticed in that podcast as it went on, I sort of noticed almost a mental exhaustion, and this is good, right? This is good stuff. Um, it's almost like practice. You know, if you just go through the motions of practicing anything, you're not going to get better. You're going to play exactly how you practice. My daughter's a softball pitcher, and we'll have situationals all the time. You know, two outs, runners are, you know, bases are loaded. You know, this is a state championship game, and we've got the three batter up, and she's a lefty. What do you think she's going to do? And by the time we're done with a 30-minute, you know, practice, we're both totally exhausted. But it was a mindful practice, and that's what I got from that podcast. So if there were some people who, you know, maybe saw or heard some hesitation, I don't think so. What I saw and heard was multiple disciplines getting together to just have a conversation and say, hey, what if? I'm here to tell you there's not any good research out there looking at the incorporation of prescribed fire in regenerative, or, you know, whatever you want to call it, regenerative systems.
Mm-hmm.
There's no better way to biomimic than to drop a drip torch right here, right now. I would do it if we could that easily here in Pennsylvania. But no one, I mean, ever since I started this 9 years ago, we've been looking for resets, right? Because, you know, there's chemical resets, there's you know, tillage to reset. And I want to reset the system from time to time based on my goals and objectives or those of my client. And I every time I hear you guys, especially Marcus, kept bringing up, you know, well, what do we know about bacteria or about fungi or about the response of soil health and this microbiome to fire? Man, I hope you guys jump on that, because that's what I want to know as well. We have been dropping prescribed fires before establishing both cattle forage and whitetail food plots for many years now. And on the surface, as you said, Marcus, we observed that it's
Mm-hmm.
fantastic for releasing nutrients. But I often wonder, how much carbon are we releasing to the atmosphere? What's the cost benefit analysis of taking all of that plant residue that we just invested a significant amount of time to grow and burning it off? So there's, as you know, there's, you know, too much of a good thing is a bad thing. And that's what I got from that podcast. And
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to say that, you know, I told you guys before we started, I was giving a talk in Springfield, Missouri, and a Marine came up to me afterwards, and he said, I just bought a farm in Missouri. I don't have a lot of money, obviously spent it all on the farm. I've been there, bought two now here. He
Mhm.
said, what tool should I buy first? You know, roller crimper, no-till drill, and you know, I sell roller crimpers, so I think he was expecting me to kind of go down that path. I said, if I were you, I would spend time working on this so that you know what you're looking at when you get out there. So that's what I heard. I heard you guys brainstorming. I heard Will
Mm-hmm.
talk about, you know, the plethora of beetles and grubs and whatever else rests under this plant residue that we're trying so hard to produce. Man, I heard collaboration and innovation. That's what I heard.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's what, when I was saying misinterpreted, I don't think that we're scrutinizing through a negative lens as it might sometimes sound, but we are scientists who are supposed to question things
Mhm.
and then work through what our hypotheses are. And if no one else has tested that, then we move forward. And that, you know, as you said, Jason, one of the things as I learn more about regenerative agricultural practices and how they might integrate into managing for turkeys or deer, one of the best tools that I could think of that could help bridge that gap from, you know, hypothetically, I'm still at hypothesis stage on this, but to me would be fire, because we live on a planet that's flammable, and fire has been an integral part of a large portion of the landscape, and specifically those that are maintained in treeless area,
Absolutely.
or with few trees. So that could be savannas, woodlands, or grasslands, or prairies, or whatever. But fire was an integral part of a large portion of those on the planet. And to me, Where you're using the term biomimicry, if we're trying to mimic nature, that tool is one of the ones in the toolbox that does that fairly well, at least as we've measured it. And that's why I kind of latched onto that. It seems like it could be an integral part of the system and would mimic the system better, and might be integrated into the system such that it better accomplishes some of your objectives related to your game.
Absolutely. Yeah. Take the Piedmont region, where I do a lot of work, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and I know it expands greater than that, but, they once had a full meter of A horizon soil, and, cotton farming came in. They literally, if you dig through the history books, bulldozed and pushed off soil to grow things like
Mm.
cotton and tobacco in other parts of the country. And, when we drop a drip torch line in South Carolina, and we've done this to hundreds of acres, and then drill in one of our multi-species biological primers, oh man, it's so beautiful. I mean, that stuff just explodes, right? And nobody's really, we need a bright graduate like Luke, grad student out there looking at the before and after to quantify, if you will, what we're seeing. I
Mm-hmm.
can tell you what we're seeing, and critter response, and obviously aesthetics, and just pure observation on the ground. And the cattle, my clients who are also into cattle and livestock absolutely love using our multi-species blends for domestic animals, because of the medicinal value, the nutrient density, and when they drop fire ahead of it, it's pretty special. It's hard to
Mm.
beat.
So, one thing that I think is important for us to lay out, as we continue to delve into this discussion is, what are we talking about when we talk about regenerative ag or regenerative practices, and like what are the objectives that center around that? So like higher level, as I'm thinking about the context of this discussion, I'm thinking about, we're doing this within the wildlife management objective perspective, right? Objective perspective. That's a good new
No,
buzzword.
that
I should
sounded
start.
good. Actually,
I
it
should
sounded
start
really good.
using.
Does that
Yeah,
have
I'm
a
gonna.
dash in
I'm
between,
gonna
Luke?
market. I'm gonna market that. If anybody wants to buy it, hit me up. Um, but we're trying to grow. We're trying to grow food and cover, right? For wildlife in general. Turkey emphasis on this podcast, obviously. But then you've got the producer's perspective. The agricultural, the row crop, or the livestock production objective. And then on top of that, you've got the objective of trying to just reduce input cost on a field, which I think those are shared by, across all those objectives. Like nobody wants to spend more money than they have to, right? And then on top of that, you also have, for lack of a better term, and if y'all want to substitute another one, feel free to do so. You kind of have like more of the, I think what most people would refer to is, and maybe this is like where your term comes in, Jason, the greenwashing. You think about like the environmental objectives. Like we just want to decrease, how much synthetic fertilizer or, herbicide or pesticides that we're putting on an acre of ground, right? And my understanding is kind of what we're harnessing in nature to try to take advantage of that is, you've got all of the insects and organisms above the ground that are feeding on the plants, that are feeding on the other insects that are feeding on the plants. And then you've got, the herbivores, and then you've got all that going back down into the soil. And then at the soil level, you have different size classes of organisms that are breaking it down further. So you've got like on the big end of the spectrum, everybody knows what an earthworm is. And then we might step down to like a mite-sized animal, and then we go down to like bacteria and fungi, which are
Microbes.
breaking down
Now we're
90%.
getting into my world. Now I'm
Yeah,
getting
yeah.
excited.
So we're breaking down, and it is those microbes. This is important to point out that my understanding is they break down. They do like 90% of the decomposition, right? And so,
So 90% of 90% of the fertility, that even if you dump it out of a sac, it's called
yeah,
bioturbation, right? It goes through some sort of microbe before it's cycled into a plant organic fraction and recycled back. Yeah.
yeah. But the important part of that is that those microbes are helping make those nutrients bioavailable to the plants. right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the
That's the fifth
focus.
grader version of it, Will.
And you know,
What's
but it's
that?
funny. That's funny you
What's
say
that,
that,
Marcus?
Marcus. Marcus said that's the fifth grade version, and it's funny because
Well,
when
that's
I
where I'm
started,
at. I was
when
in
I
first
started,
grade with Bronson.
well, no, we all are, right? Because at Mississippi State, nothing against Mississippi State, but you know, I had one soil class, and I absolutely hated it. The professor was an egghead. I didn't enjoy him at all. He didn't have a
I wonder if
personality.
I
None of
had
the
the
kids.
same one.
It could have been. It could have been. But and the only thing I laugh when I go back to it because if we called it dirt, he would dock points. He got angry if we
Yeah.
didn't
It's
call
the
it
same
soil.
guy.
And now I'd
It's
like
the
to
same
find him
one.
because nothing he was talking about, nothing we were managing or looking at was soil. I would argue a lot of kids deserve their points back because it was dirt. It was degraded. It was a degraded medium that did not have life in it. And I want to make sure that that's the focus of this. You know, I heard another podcast that some clients sent to me before, knowing that I'm in the regenerative soil health space. And these guys basically, we'll just call it poo-pooed on regenerative. They said, hey, listen, this works for a couple of years, but then you've got to come back in with your genetically modified organisms, you know, Roundup Ready soybeans, and just nuke the snot out of the field and start over, you know, knock back that weed profile, blah, blah, blah. To me, that's a complete misunderstanding of the system. You didn't understand. You didn't pay attention in class. So I want to focus on biology. I listen to these podcasts and nobody talks about respiration, CO2. Nobody talks about the biology. It all starts with the biology. And, you know, these plants that are around me, they're farming the microbes. So I had a client in South Carolina call me and he's trying to get rid of a specific plant that he's calling a weed. And I said, listen, as long as the microbiome, have you ever you know, you go by McDonald's. I grew up in the 80s, 90s, you know, late 70s, 80s, 90s. My mom used to take us to the playground. I don't know if they still have them or not. The McDonald's playgrounds, the moms would chat while the dads were at work, and the kids, we would play. And
Mm-hmm.
so my gut bacteria, my microbiome is demanding more of that, right? It's nutrient lacking, it's calorie dense, and it's even hard for me to this day to go by a McDonald's Golden Arch and not think about how good that, you know, burger or whatever would be, or those nuggets. Now I'll puke if I eat it. But this is what the weeds, you know, pick your favorite weed.
I'm the
We
same way,
won't get into
Jason, but when we're on the road, Marcus doesn't allow me to stop at McDonald's. He hates
Uh,
McDonald's.
good for
my
you, Mark.
my microbes have hated McDonald's specifically since I was little.
That's a good
I
deal.
don't understand.
You've just
That's
I
got
like
something.
all the other ones. It's
You've
just
just
that
got
one.
something against the good Scottish culture that came up with that food.
Oh, is that what it is?
I mean, that must be some
McDonald's,
kind
think
of
right?
so. I love Scottish food.
maybe there's some kind of epigenetic effect going on there. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm
I
So
have
I'm
so
this.
sorry.
anyway, I want to
You're
point
making
out
a
that the
serious point.
biology. No,
Yeah.
that's a good point. Is that you know there is a lot of variation. It's complex, right? When you try to label or whatever, you in nature you can't do that. So these plants are farming the microbes. So when you're trying to change the profile, the weed profile as we'll call it, until you change that microbial profile, you're going to be looking at the same plants. I'm here to tell you that. And that was one of the first reasons that I started playing around with multi-species cocktails, if you will, these biological primers, because I wanted to prime and shock the biology to say, hey, we don't just want ragweed, it's a great plant, but we also want some of these other forbs and legumes and grasses, etc. So I've listened to a couple podcasts that are sent to me that clients listen to, and I want to make sure that we start to talk more about biology and about biomarkers, not just all of these non-living, you know, markers on the standard or conventional soil test.
Well, Jason, I don't know if this is the right place to insert this question, but this is something that gets posed to me a lot, and you're talking about it with the weeds. Can you kind of walk us through when you're starting this process in a field that's had a history of degradation from something. Start wherever that is for you. And I hear that a lot is when you're starting the process, you've got a bunch of plants that you don't want, non-native plants. For me, that's probably going to be ryegrass just about everywhere I go. But
Should have pulled
we've
that
got
one out right before that.
we got
I love
we got
ryegrass. I love
we
it.
got several plants that you could pick from, but people bring that up as a barrier. Like I've got
Sure.
this weed problem, so what do you do about that? Like
So that's probably,
what are the problems and what do you do about it?
yeah, so that's probably an entire podcast in and of itself.
I figured it was.
And as you can tell, I love talking about this stuff. But like your, whoever the clients or whoever they are questioning, I hear this, I don't know, maybe 20 times a day. And I think this is where we go back to that mindset and maybe a recalibration or a re-understanding of what are weeds. I'll use the term weed. Um, they are, a friend of mine at Clemson, called them the ambulance workers one time, or first responders. And I thought, wow, that works in my brain. They show up for a reason. And I don't have one of my favorite, I have tools laying all over the place in case I need to pull a prop up. One of my favorite tools, I probably shouldn't share this because now everybody's going to do it and maybe even trademark it like Will and his phrase there. But one of my favorite tools is a small mirror. And now that the cell phones have that flip, you can flip the camera around. I take a mirror with me as often as I can because I'll throw it on the ground and I'll say, right there's your problem. If we degrade a soil, if we don't put a plant there, nature's going to do that. That's what happens in nature. Now, some of these plants that people just absolutely hate just happen to be the greatest plants at restoring ecosystem function. Early responders. Does that mean I want them there forever? No. But there are many times where I look at a plant profile or a weed profile and I say, hey, we're doing pretty good right now. I'm happy with the moisture. Maybe there's a little bit of soil aggregate going on and aggregate stability. Where to start is a function of the client's goals and objectives to me. When I started, I just said, I want to eliminate toxins and I want to give this land a chance to heal. I think it was Stoddard Marcus who used that term land handler. I love that ever since I read that. I just bought 100 acres to my north here. The two of them are separated by 18 years of my management. This farm I'm sitting on was farmed by that same farmer. I'm here to tell you that those weed seeds are never going away. But I'm also here to tell you that, like Will said, you start to get down to that bacteria, you start to look at the fungi, you look at the protozoa, which are my favorites. That's kind of nerdy, right? When you look at what's going on down there and you start to change more specifically that fungal to bacterial ratio, the weed profile changes dramatically. When you change fertility, the weed profile changes dramatically. And the other thing that cracks me up about a lot of the weeds that, Palmer amaranth, the pigweeds, mare's tail, so on and so forth, they are some of the easiest plants to smother out. It's just, it's a heck of a lot easier on the surface to spray some kind of, chemical or toxin on it. But, to me, again, the weeds that you're looking at are a book. They're like reading a history book to me. I can essentially tell you, or getting better at telling you, what has gone on and what has happened. There's so many times you probably see some ragweed ambrosia behind me. It's all around me, and I welcome it after doing intensive studies on what ragweed is doing in that rhizosphere. So that root soil interface is the rhizosphere, and that's where the game is played, to be honest with you. And if it's here for free, I sell seed all the time, and I tell people, hey, I'd let that ragweed go. That's my favorite cover crop. And it still is to this day. It really is my favorite cover crop. So, you can get in there and reset that system with prescribed fire, with tillage, with chemicals to start. I'm not against that. And again, that's up to you. I didn't do it. I literally sold all of my tillage equipment except one disc in case, for fire breaks, etc. I got rid of, all my Roundup and stuff I just gave to people I don't like. I didn't say that, did I? So I just pulled out cold turkey. Rick Haney and I kind of have a saying, "Don't be a wiener." To weaning off of synthetics maybe makes sense to somebody who's trying to hit yield marks and sell their product. And that whole food discussion is another conversation. You kind of mentioned about regenerative. What is regenerative? When I'm the purchasing manager for most of my family's food. It's very easy for us to shop at the local grocery store. I go around the edge because that's where most of your somewhat healthy foods are. During COVID, I was in Texas for 9 months. We finally got allowed into our local restaurant in the hill country of Texas. Got allowed into our local grocery store. I told my child, I forget which kid was with me, "You go get water. I'm hitting the veggies." I ran, and it was like a one of these supermarket sweep games. I ran to the vegetable section, and I'm like, it's crickets. There's nobody around. Everybody ran to the middle aisles where all the processed food was. So when it comes to me buying from a regenerative farmer, I want transparency. I want to ask him or her, how are you growing these products, right? To me, it's not, I don't care if you're regenerative certified or verified or organic or USDA, this and that. That means nothing to me. I want to know what your practices are and, what chemicals are you using or how are you growing your livestock? So I think we need to get away from some of these terms and focus more on this conversation. Jason, how do you manage your farm? And like Marcus just said, what decisions do you make when you have a weed or a plant that's just dominating your open landscape that you don't want? Well, generally, I use the mower. I decided for me, I'm not saying this is right for you, after doing deep dives on the endocrine disruption and just the massive disruption to at the very cellular level that synthetic chemicals, herbicides, the sides, biocides, insecticides, neonics, all that does to my body. My family and I have opted to eliminate those from our farm. This farm to my north that I just bought has a neonic wrapped around the soybeans. I saw 2 hen turkeys in there yesterday when I was collecting some respiration data. Not a single pull with those hens. So I need you guys. And, my son and I and my daughter, our primary goal for that new farm is to develop the most beautiful turkey habitat you could imagine from just, from the landscape level of diversity. So when it comes to the weeds, if they're there for a reason, number one, I don't think we should curse them. I think we should thank them. Quite frankly, you will find that a lot of these weeds are doing a better job at feeding deer, feeding invertebrates, and restoring ecosystem function than even the plants in my bag or the seeds in my bag. I would also say that if you study the plant, let's say you're having problems like a client of mine the other day with a sedge, right? He was in South Carolina. The sedges were a problem to him. I asked him to teach me about, the life cycle of a sedge. How does this thing live? How does it make a living? And he didn't know much. And I said, when you understand more about your opponent than your opponent does, whether it's in sports or business or competing with ragweed or sedge or whatever, that's when you win. So you've got to figure out the life cycle and get ahead of it. And that's what we do. We use cover crops as smother crops, weed suppression mats. Do we ever get rid of every single weed? Absolutely not. Do I want to? Absolutely not. So, again, I throw it back to the client. It's my job to teach you the truth about chemicals. It's my job to teach you what tillage does to arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi and the fact that the microbes are constantly rebuilding the house. And that's what we want. They're like employees down there building a house for us and, for antlers and et cetera. So I don't get excited over weeds. I welcome them and I look at a weed profile and I say, okay, how can I change it? And quite frankly, I like to use plants to change the profile, takes a lot of patience, takes a lot of time. But as a client in Iowa said to me yesterday, it cracks me up. No, he said, I find it laughable that we destroyed this ecosystem. This is a non-farming type client, sold a business, has been buying up big sections in Iowa. He said, I find it laughable that people would quit this regenerative form of farming and they would expect 5 or 10 years to be like an aha, here we go, I'm not having to use anything anymore moment. He said it took us 150 plus years to destroy it. It's probably going to take us that long or longer to fix it. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the people who think that way, this is for them. The people who are looking for instant gratification, I think they should grab a chemical and they should go to town. I just fear for what that means for the ecosystem health and the health of them and their families.
Yeah. So there were really a couple of big questions that I had today, Jason, and one of the things that you touched on just a minute ago was yield, right? And um, so I get that a lot of herbicides and fertilizers affect the soil microbiome. There's pretty it seems like there's pretty clear data on that it affects the bacteria and the fungi in the soil and things like that. But then from just a yield perspective, like on a per acre basis, let's just say that I'm working with a landowner that's got 1 10-acre large nutrition plot, and all he wants to do is grow deer with the largest possible antlers that he can. His yield per acre on if he's planting that field in soybeans, just a monocrop, let's just call it a monocrop Roundup Ready soybeans, he's going to be able to produce more pounds of crude protein per acre with conventional ag than he is with regenerative ag. Um, but then,
I question that possibly. That's a
okay,
theory, but yeah, go ahead.
okay. Well, my understanding is that the yield per acre is generally higher with conventional ag, but then the profit doesn't necessarily follow with that because you're going with so much higher input cost with the conventional ag. And so the price that you're spending per acre goes down. And so even if your yield goes down, your profit is still better.
Yeah, no, that's that. There's so much to unpack there, Will, and you said it. You said it
Okay.
right. I mean, in the regenerative agricultural world, thanks to Gabe Brown and guys like that, they're saying, hey, wait a minute. Basic rule of economics is
Right.
input, right? You're looking at your inputs. If it costs us more to produce a bushel of corn or wheat or whatever, soybeans,
Right.
none of that matters, right? It's kind of like me. I've been around a lot of top line managers who tell me they have a $150 million business, but by the time they get down to it, their family, they're really only providing maybe a couple $1 million, which is not a very good return on that kind of investment. So
Right.
you're right. Looking at yield, let's talk about that for a minute. So one of the things Fred Provenza has been a huge help for me in this regard. One of the things that turned me to this form of biomimicry, I used to grow monoculture right where I'm sitting, actually, monoculture Eagle Forage soybeans that would get so tall. I was so proud of them. I used manure, I fertilized the snot out of them. I would bring clients here like I still do today. We would walk off my driveway maybe 6, 10 feet, and we would step back about 5 feet from each other, and we could no longer see each other. These beans were so tall, right? Super impressive, magazine quality TV, whatever. But if you look at what whitetails want. Whitetails at one point probably consumed over 150 different species before we got here and started to decide what they should consume, right? Monoculture agriculture, when you really file it all down, is corn, soybeans, wheat, maybe a few things here and there, not a whole lot.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I've noticed is the expression of native forbs since I've eliminated the sides, the herbicides. The other thing I want to say is we had, my original farm was 95 acres. And I thought, wow, if I can hold specific bucks for my kids to kill on 95 acres, we're probably doing pretty good. Or attract them at that specific time to kill what we call OPB, other people's bucks. We had a specific buck we called Blade, and he had a running mate. His name was Bumpers. Very good animals, both mature animals. We killed Blade at 6.5 years old. Bumpers, he disappeared at 7.5. No idea what happened to him. I didn't kill these animals because I felt like I needed mature bucks to help me learn, right? We don't have that many mature bucks in Pennsylvania, especially, small acreage like this. I was getting some ammo reloaded, I don't know, a few miles as a crow flies from my farm. And the gentleman took his camera, as most guys do, right? And he pulled it up and he said, Do you know this buck? And I'm kind of tight-lipped about my bucks, right? Like other
Mm-hmm.
people are. So I hesitated. Well, my daughter, who was about belt high, looked up at me and said, Dad, that's Blade. And I wanted to, don't do that. So anyway, I said, that's interesting. Can you tell me where this picture's at? And he told me all about the habitat. Super mature, closed canopy, hemlock, pine, maybe some rock oak, etc. It's not what you would consider great habitat. And the more I studied, I'm trying to put this into a nutshell here. The more I studied it, I was like, okay, this doesn't make sense. That buck is leaving my food plot, which and we had chicory, clover, the other, alfalfa, the more conventional stuff at the time. He was leaving my fields to go to this, what I considered a biological desert. Well, what I realized real quick with what he was doing is he was stripping the bark off of hemlock. Now, there's a lot of plant secondary compounds in hemlock, terpenes and all these things that Fred Provenza talks about that we're going to learn from this MSU study. If we look at it and other studies, what those bucks were doing is they were trying to balance toxicities. Too much of a good thing is a bad thing. So these bucks were leaving my property, and I've got a few hemlocks. Our woolly adelgid did a number of most of our hemlocks. He has kind of an east, northeast facing slope. For some reason, they did better. I don't know why. But my point is these animals were leaving. By no means am I expecting to hold two specific bucks on 95 acres 100% of the time. But it got me thinking on a landscape level. What's driving these deer to other properties, to these other habitats? I quickly realized through some DNA metabarcoding, collecting poop, sending it out, holy cow, Suga canadensis, that's hemlock, right, Marcus? The more I learn nowadays, I have to get rid of some things. So I think it's Suga, I know that, showed up in this deer poop. Well, they were leaving what we thought was heavily fertilized, highly nutritious, great yields, high crude protein, to get to these plant secondary compounds, tertiary compounds. That taught me balance. That's when I said, okay, whitetails they're herbivores, right? But they're ruminants. That's how they make their living. They're constantly eating based on their relatively small rumen size compared to like an elk or a cow. They have to be very efficient, constantly moving, constantly eating. So I started to study what deer are actually eating, not what I'm planning, comparing the two, what I'm planning against what they're actually eating. What I found is they weren't looking for these massive nutritional plots full of, forage soybeans. They were looking for diversity. And if you've ever watched, I observe deer out of this blind, which you can't see because it's buried in vetch. I observe deer out here all the time. We'll have a mature buck that we've never seen come out 300 yards to our northeast, take a couple of bites, turn around, and leave. Why is he doing that? I mean, it has to. You've got to question that. Did he come out, just hypothetically throwing this out there, and nibble on some of the plantain and chicory that I have? That it's a dewormer, right? It's a medicinal for him. Whitetail deer cannot go to a pharmacy like we can. They cannot take a drug. They cannot get a jab in the arm. They have got to learn how to self-medicate. The flavor feedback mechanism, the nutritional wisdom that Bronson brought up, that Fred Provenza has studied extensively. These things are all real, and whether you believe it or not, I think is probably a function of whether you buy into this. When I started, to your point, Will, when I started this, I told my kids who sat out here in this blind, it's an elevated redneck blind, since the time they were 5 and 6, and consistently every year killed a mature buck. I said, guys, I'm starting something new. When we open up that door the first morning of deer season, you may not see a single deer, and what you're going to look at is probably going to shock you. And they're, at that age, they're like, whatever. The crazy thing is, we open that window, to continue our shopping spree with mature bucks. And that's because we created something different, an island of sorts that other people, and we're surrounded by conventional, modern day chemical agriculture. So I, I like tonnage when I'm trying to suppress weeds, when I'm trying to get carbon to the microbes and cycle that nutrient, that organic fraction of nutrients. But yield and tonnage just don't impress me anymore. I'm looking for diversity, and I want to give whitetails the opportunity. They're concentrate selectors, right, Marcus? They're not out there just pulling a bunch of the same plant. They're not looking to do that. And if they are, I would question what you have planted. If you watch them in our regen plots, they'll walk around and they'll pick and choose specific plots. And yes, some will come momentarily for a quick nibble and they'll vacate. I'll never forget my daughter 2 years ago passed a buck that all of us, she was 12, would think she's crazy, let alone on 95 acres in Pennsylvania as a 12-year-old. And as that deer left the field, I said, I don't know what you just did. Why did you do that? And she said, I just don't need another buck with short tines. He was a great wide 10. He was every bit of 6.5. We'd never seen him before. And he came out so quick, she didn't have time to think about who he was and kill him. And she looked at his short tines and said, I just don't want another short tine 10 point on my wall. 6.5-year-old deer in Pennsylvania. And I told her, I asked her, why did you not kill him? She said, honestly, Dad, I think I made a mistake, as he turned around and walked away. But they usually come out in this field and they'll stay out here for 20 minutes to an hour. And me picking up little things, I thought that's interesting. That's an interesting observation. Why did he come out here? He didn't spook. He didn't even look at any of the deer in the field. He grabbed something, turned around, and he left. And, he was later killed, and I don't want to tell you how big he was. I hope she doesn't watch this because my son and I never showed a picture and told her about it, but just a mind-blowing deer for Pennsylvania. So, I like yield too. Like, I get it. I understand. Like, we're all shooting for that. But I'm here to tell you, I don't think white-tailed deer are looking for massive yield. I think they're looking for hyper diversity and the microbes, guys. It's about feeding the microbes diversity too. These plants they release exudates, right? So you have all these, carbon and all these acids, oxalic and malic and citric. They're releasing all these sugars and foods, and they're feeding microbes. Do you think they're doing that for free? Here in America, we have a system called welfare. I would look at a golf course. I would look at my neighbor farmers who farm conventionally, and I would call that a welfare system. It's a put constant inputs. If you pull the fertigation from a golf course, I've been told it's dead by dinner time. Now, I don't know if that's an exaggeration, but that's a synthetic, spoon-fed, propped-up system. This system right here, as you can tell, 5-6 feet tall, and I didn't pick the tallest. There's some taller stuff out in the middle. In fact, we trample this doing some little studies. We grew all of this on the organic fraction, on that 5th grade, that simple hierarchical, how does the food chain, food web operate? That's how we're growing all these plants. And you know what? I ate my words. My kids are like that. We are seeing more bucks, especially OPBs, again, other people's bucks. Our goal as a small property owner is to kill an OPB. We just love that. And some of the neighbors are teachers and community people, and we just get a kick out of killing bucks that we never saw, never nourished all summer. We just had something that they wanted at a key time. So I know that was kind of a ramble. I'm trying to get a lot of this stuff in. I want people to understand that respiration, that feeding, diverse root exudates to a diversity of microbes, that's what's going to equate to a diversity of plants or weeds or whatever you want to call them in your food plots, not spraying a selective herbicide. Let me give you this example too. This cracked me up. One of my first observations, I'm guilty of it. I'm not picking on anybody, but for years we planted monoculture clover, right? I remember being in my little apartment in Starkville, Mississippi, reading the Whitetail News or whatever it was from the Whitetail Institute. Scots are great people, sold out, so I can make fun of the company now. deer clover. Remember when deer clover came out and the guy was wearing a white lab coat and he was out there, letting two plants breed and he was producing the best deer clover? Well, it's just crazy. And then we would come out to these fields of monoculture clover and spray one of the dims, right? Clefidim, sethoxydim, whatever. I'm not a chemist anymore because they're gone. And then we would spray all the grasses out of that field. What was that? You have to ask yourself, the grasses, that was a symptom, right? Cough, sore throat, runny nose, that's a symptom. What is the underlying problem? What is the underlying cause? And I call what we do functional ecology and functional management now. You mentioned holistic. I love that term too. If you look at the underlying cause of why those grasses were trying to grow in a clover monoculture system that is pumped so full of nitrogen, it's trying to get more carbon into the system, right? So the system is saying, hey, I need grasses because grasses put more carbon in the system. And then we're going out there with an expensive, costly to the ecology, also costly to our own health toxin, spraying it on the grasses and walking away and going, oh boy, look at that. Let me Facebook that, take a picture of that monoculture clover plot and how good I did. No, we need to focus on carbon nitrogen ratio. And we need to say, okay, if that field wants grasses, let's give it some grasses that we want it to have. Maybe not annual ryegrass or perennial ryegrass or whatever you guys don't like, but let's give it some grasses and let it, right? It's to me, we're addressing symptoms. We're not addressing the underlying cause. And getting back to wild turkeys, guys, my son completed his turkey slam when he was 8 years old. And he voluntarily, at 12, I believe, he's 18, just graduated high school. He voluntarily said, Dad, we cannot kill another turkey on our farm until we get things right. And that kind of hurts my feelings, I'll be honest with you. I get to travel to see a lot of properties. I go places where they're covered up with turkeys. I come here where I used to kill a longbeard, call my brother who was 30 minutes away and say, you better get over there. There's a couple longbeards that don't have hens, go kill them. And he would go kill it an hour later. Now we see a couple longbeards walking together, maybe a couple jakes with them, two hens like I just saw June 14th, and no poults. It's frightening. And I personally believe that obviously it's a complex system. There's a lot going on. Everybody has their, opinion on what the cause is. It is not predators. Obviously, when the populations get low, Marcus, as Dr. Leopold always taught us, predators and Aldo Leopold, predators are key. Without predators, we don't have prey. Without prey, we don't have predators. But I personally think that biomimicry, placing some transparency on things like neonicotinoids and all the toxic sides and what it does to the invertebrates, what it's doing to right down to the cellular level of hen turkeys and fertility. I think all of those things are piling on, if you will, to have an impact on our turkey population.
Yeah, I think. Well, I mean, you covered a lot of ground there, so I
Yeah,
don't know. I don't know what. No, you're good.
I have a few things to say too.
Okay.
Do you have
Marcus,
something?
Can I get one more in? Just to kind of finish up.
I feel like I haven't spoken in like 30 minutes.
I'm sorry, guys. There's so many things. Listen,
y'all have been going back and forth.
Well,
but you said some things about deer diet, and I have studied that at great lengths.
And I mean, what I'm thinking too is it gets back to what we were talking about earlier is differences of objectives, right? So, and I think about, if I've got, let's just say another example, I've got 100 acres and I've got that 5-acre conventional soybean field in it, but the remaining 95 acres is probably not that much, but all my upland at least, let's just say that I'm managing with sunlight and fire, right? So there is that diversity present at the property scale that deer have the opportunity to choose from, but I'm just providing this 5 acres over here as kind of like, this is just like I'm viewing it as supplemental feed, right? So I've still got 95 acres that is intact and more, functioning naturally from an ecosystem health perspective. And I don't have all those things going on negatively affecting the microbiome of the soil and things like that. But I am producing it over here, and I'm not trying to dismiss the downsides that you bring up associated with conventional agriculture. I'm just saying, those are present, but is that still, perhaps a technique that we want to use to meet certain objectives? I don't know, but I also agree with you, and I know where you're coming from. I mean, Dr. Craig Harper has done some studies where they've allowed food plots to diversify, and they haven't controlled all the weeds in them, and it's clear that like attraction to deer
Mm.
increases. And
Mm.
so it's like we have all these different multiple objectives, I think, a lot of times that we're trying to juggle at once. I
Yeah.
guess the root of my
And
point.
this soil talker, and I'm not selling this, but this technology has allowed me to figure out things like you're talking with Dr. Harper and his research. Man, there was a lot to unpack there. But first and foremost, a lot of modern day conventional agriculture, a lot of that product either goes to China, it goes
Mhm.
overseas, and it goes into highly processed junk food, right?
Mhm.
So
Sure.
the agricultural world is highly subsidized by people like us who pay a lot of tax money. So that's a whole other conversation to be had. But to your point on the diversity, absolutely. When I start with clients or we're just whatever re meeting about their property as a whole, I'll say, listen, I know you want to do the regenerative or focus on soil health. What if you keep a field in a conventional, like you're talking monoculture, maybe even you plow it or do whatever you want to do to it, and then you play around with, some other parts of the property, food plots that are regenerative. I see nothing wrong with that. That's citizen science at its finest. I can tell you, I was just hired by a new client in South Carolina, and I told him, I said, based on your personality, I don't know that I was trying to offend him, but I want people to have realistic expectations too, right? Based on your fast paced personality, I'm not so sure 100% regenerative soil health is going to be for you. And his response was, were you trying to make me mad? And I said, no, I'm not trying to make you mad. I just want to make sure that you understand that it's going to take a lot of patience, and it's going to take a lot of failing. And it's going to take, and my clients who are listening or people who are into regenerative, food plotting, are grinning ear to ear right now because there have been times where we're on the edge of the cliff and we'll call each other as a support network and say, I don't get it. I've done this to Gabe Brown. I've done everything right. I'm looking at PLFA, which is phospholipid fatty acids, and I've completely changed the microbial profile, and I cannot get rid of this cocklebur that my dadgum dogs are bringing in the house. And he'll laugh and he'll say, have you thought about this? And bam, just because I didn't think about that, I go out and I change it. So I have nothing. I'm not telling everybody this is for them, nor am I saying that your legacy property should only be, food plotted with regenerative practices. But I can tell you, when that client, before he hired me, he said, how many clients do you have who started regenerative food plotting and quit? And I was quiet for a minute because I was thinking. And he goes, did I lose you? And I said, no, I'm thinking. And he goes, well, right there's the answer. I have not had anybody start this yet and quit. And I think, maybe to be fair, what you have to understand about my clients and probably most of the people who listen to this podcast is we love our properties, right? It's a passion project. These are legacy properties. We're going to hand them down to our kids. So when they get into this, it just makes sense. I can't tell you how many
Mhm.
times I hear that. It just makes sense. But I have nothing. I mean, I personally think that in functional ecology, prescribed fire and, maybe even some monoculture ag, regenerative, food plotting, timber stand improvement, forest, whatever you want to call it, whatever you want to, native vegetation management, whatever you want to do is a huge part. And the more complex you make a property, as we all know and learned, the more attractive it's going to be. So
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well, I guess that's
Yeah.
kind of where I'm at is I'm trying to figure out how this all fits together, you know?
Hmm. Well, I had a few thoughts. One, Jason, you were talking about deer diet earlier, and I have done a lot of work and thought about how deer decide what to eat. And I've read a lot of Provenza's work on this, and it's influenced me substantially. And I have said something along the lines of this in various capacities. It's been remarkable to me as someone who has looked at what deer were eating in, I don't know how many states, but a lot of different places. It's super common if you take one scat sample. So we're just talking about deer, defecate one time. It's very consistent that one sample might represent 50 plus genera, not species. That
Or more.
even
Yeah,
when
a
you're,
lot more. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's remarkably consistent that you will have dozens and dozens and dozens, even when you're in an agricultural landscape or, one that's being supplementally fed. Uh, even in those contexts, I have always found it remarkable how many plant species are still represented in that. And I think, what you were saying earlier is reflected in that data, that diversity, you're giving animals a choice through diversity to choose what they need. And that, as concentrate selectors, they're really good at doing that. And I appreciate that.
Yeah.
When I was asking you about the weeds earlier, I was thinking about turkeys, and from my observations, going over lots of properties, working with a lot of landowners, across the South in particular. But I hear from other professionals in other parts of the world, and I have seen it for myself, and to include, your state with your property in Pennsylvania. I really commonly see a lack of or complete absence of structure that I would consider conducive to brooding. And that's why I was asking you about the weed issues. While some of those may not be a big issue for deer or other species, for poult rearing in particular, structurally, they can be quite detrimental. And there are some species that I deal with commonly where they don't go away. Like Bermuda, it doesn't go away. I haven't figured out how to make it go away. Kogon grass is another one that doesn't seem to ever go away. And it sounded like to me when you were talking about, I mean, I fully recognize and even intrinsically my self-value taking the synthetics out and understand that as part of it. But it sounded like to me what you were saying is as you go down this path over time, you shift the microbial community and processes and soil structure and all the other things that are going in that, and that essentially over time starts to reduce the competition from these unwanted weeds. But I wonder about some of those that seem to stick around and be common problems. Do you have experience with those, particularly from a turkey standpoint, because they cause issues at a critical life stage structurally?
Yeah. 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 When you guys got into that conversation in that podcast about, how does this impact poults? And then, what about, turkey, adult turkeys? That to me was exciting, and that was the innovative part, right? That's where I thought, man, there's a plethora of research that can be done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always plants. I've come to the realization that I don't have any tattoos, but if I were to get one, it would probably be ragweed. For some reason, I just shook some, and now there's pollen all over the place. But for some reason, ragweed doesn't want to leave my farm. Now, if you understood how degraded this field that I'm sitting in was, and technically still is, it's mind blowing. So I think some of these plants, in the evolutionary scope of things, 10, 20, 30, even 100 years, it's nothing. It's a spit in the wind. It's a drop in the bucket. So I guess I look at time, being much, much broader than, I'm taking notes and everything for, future generations if they so choose to manage this way. But absolutely, there are some plants that seem to fight it out and want to stick around, and I think that speaks to the level of degradation that you're looking at. Like this
Mm-hmm.
ragweed, I sent you guys a slide right before, I don't know if you saw it or not,
Mm-hmm.
but I gave a
Yeah.
presentation in Springfield with some data that, me and Dr. Rick Haney had. And this ragweed has the ability in the rhizosphere where that root sits to completely change the outcome of a soil test. And if you just jump a couple inches or whatever to, a clover plant and get the soil around its rhizosphere, you would swear it was in a completely different field, completely different farm. So that to me speaks to the, conventional soil testing. It's been so misleading and so wrong. And, the calibration is not here. And if you think it is, go to the dead zone in the Gulf, or look at, our food today. Our human foods are causing cancer. They're causing a lot of issues. I mean, I think, when we change that profile, it absolutely changes. But there's things that we'll never get rid of, just because, not in our lifetimes anyway. But, I think, I held up my soil talker. I'll give you another, for instance, up to a minute or two before I jumped on this. I went over to the farm that I'm buying now, and I've got some. So our soil talker, and very few. I'm not selling this. I don't think most people need this. I created it because I wanted to know in real time, in situ, in the field, what does this management, how does it impact what the microbes think? Everything I do now is how to please the microbes. And I was tired of sending off a soil sample to Texas to my friend Rick Haney, waiting for that to get there. Sometimes it could get, not his lab, it can get mixed up in a lab, it can get lost in the mail, or it's just the time drove me nuts. So I wanted to develop something. So Rick and I developed what we call the soil talker. So I put basically a can in the ground, and I blow up the gas exchange that's going on. So CO2, everything else that's going on down there, I blow it up, or we blow it up, Rick and I. I came out here in this particular field, and it was just shy of 5,000 parts per million, which doesn't mean anything to anyone. It's relative. At 5,000 parts per million, I could probably grow. Well, I can guarantee you, I could grow 100 bushel of corn with zero nitrogen, right? Because carbon and nitrogen are married; they're always together. They come together. CO2 has a C in it. That's carbon. Then I jumped over to an ag field, a soybean field that's been managed properly by a neighbor farmer, and I got 2,000, like 2,100. So I went from my cover crops to his field. Then he has a field near me that he planted in soybeans. It's a very small field. It's where I've been seeing the hen turkeys without poults. Soybeans were wrapped in a neonic, unfortunately. He left it go. He hasn't sprayed it yet. I don't know why. He knows that my honeybees sit right on the other side of the hedgerow, and I've kind of expressed that I really don't want the toxin sprayed around my honeybees. So, and he's a good guy, so I suspect maybe that's part of it. The other part is the deer just annihilate this small 3/4, 1 acre soybean field, and it's now all weeds, what we would call weeds. So I sunk a tube in that, and that one read 3,000 parts per million. So it was interesting to me, excluding my cover crop, fall reload field, and just looking at his soybean field production ag that he's actually shooting for yield was so much lower than the one he planted in the same exact, soybean, but kind of left it go. There was a significant respiration. So respiration is CO2, right? So we breathe in oxygen, breathe out CO2. So if you take my meter and stick it in one of your classrooms, Marcus, you're going to get a spike. It's going to breed all these kids, people sitting around thinking, take it to a factory. It's going to go even higher because people are building widgets and whatever. So my goal is to put those microbes to work, because again, that's where, when the plant exudes root exudates, those microbes thank it by bringing the plant nutrients. And the welfare system is fertilizer out of a bag, right? You're interrupting or interfering with that system. I found it interesting this morning that soybean field he let go has higher microbial biomass than the other one that he's been managing for yield. And it's to your point, Marcus, is that there's a lot of quote unquote weeds growing up, that really aren't bad deer food, to be honest with you, and it's pretty
Mm-hmm.
diverse from the weed profile, even though he's been spraying it.
Well, I think that's another question that has surfaced, and Will and I have talked a little bit about this offline too. Is how do old fields? I'm going to use that term, and even though if there's plant ecologists listening, they would get mad about that. Old fields that are young in their tenure, we'll say, where you got a bunch of a high diversity of forbs and other annual plants and maybe some other herbaceous perennial stuff. So you've just got a diversity of
Sure.
plants in a field. How would those compare in some
That's a
of
good
these?
question, and it's something I've looked at extensively. So when you look at conservation agriculture, one of the key, I guess, management metrics is complex rotations, right? So, they want to constantly not corn, soybeans is not a rotation, right? That's an alternation. So they want to constantly be rotating in different crops and different multi-species crops. When I look at those fields like the one I'm sitting in now, and it's been dry. We haven't had rain here. I don't remember the last rain. It's been quite a while. 5,000 parts per million is massively. I'm happy with that. Without having rain. If you were to go to a hayfield or some of these fields that farmers have just been basically allowing to let go, or I even have a couple myself that I just let do whatever they do. What you see is they're actually at the other end of the spectrum where they're probably at 2,000. This one's at 5,000. So fallow, you would think just letting it go fallow would be better from a microbial response. It doesn't seem like that's always the truth. And I think when we're incorporating, you face it, you can see hairy vetch behind me, but most of my blends have 15, 14 to 17, and the custom ones I make for myself, sometimes I'm putting 150 different species in one, in the drill at one time. So that's a different leaf structure, right? You've got the ragweed, you've got a grass, you've got, a vetch. Everything has a different, these are my solar panels, by the way, has a different leaf structure. It's capturing sunlight at a different angle, at a different height, whatever. And they're all exuding a completely different root exudate, right? That's safe to assume. So I think again, that's why I like that bio prime or biological primers. I feel like nature, it blows my mind how resilient it is. I mean, some of these soils can sit dormant, and then all of a sudden you give them the right conditions and a completely different plant grows. I remember being in Missouri with a client of mine who's a very good regenerative type farmer. Actually, he won the Missouri Conservation Whatever of the Year award, big turkey guy. He is actually, they chose his site for one of the research plots for Mississippi State's research. We were walking it with a state biologist, and one of the things they noticed is in doing this and introducing these diverse plants, it actually brought back some native plants that some of the by younger, I mean even 40s, they didn't identify them, they didn't know what they were. And they told me, I wasn't there, but they told me they actually had a plant pathologist or some kind of plant identification person come and tell them what was growing. Some beautiful wildflowers. And by the way, we were burning those fields, but we were starting to bring out, I guess, or express a really interesting profile from the past that we thought was pretty neat. So that's kind of a whole other topic, and that's why I think fire is underutilized, and we need you guys to incorporate that. And like I said, this new farm of mine, turkeys are going to be our primary goal. So we're excited to hit that.
I think, given that objective that you have for that new piece, that's a perfect segue into thinking about, one of the things that Marcus and I have discussed pretty extensively, and we talked about a good bit with Bronson on that episode, is just worrying about, plant density being a little bit too high in a conventional regenerative plot, if that even makes sense, a conventional regenerative
Yeah.
plot. So, and what I mean by that is like, how are you thinking about potentially modifying the regenerative practices, or which one specifically are you going to use when you have brooding cover, the structure that represents good brooding cover for turkeys in
Yeah.
mind as an objective?
So I always tell people we are pioneers in this, right? So this is a pretty new thing. One of the things that my clients had noted about your first podcast is I've got a product. This is Fall Reload. I have a product that I call Fall Nourishment. It was designed for the guys who said, "Hey, I really like Fall Reload, and I could roller crimp this and do a really fine job, but we need a thicker, more dense mat that we can, lay down and obviously suppress the weeds."
Mm-hmm.
One of the first things guys said was, "Oh no, if we're planting this, in the fall sometime and letting it go till, depending on where you're at geographically, I probably could roll this. I could have rolled it, a while ago. I'm leaving this up for one reason. Every time I drive around here with my daughter, we see nesting hens in and out of these fields. Now, I think we're
Mm-hmm.
getting to the tail end of that nesting season here on the
Mm-hmm.
farm. Um, but we do bump a lot of nesting hens out of this, and we've had to adapt that on some, especially in the south, which I can't really figure that out. We've had high densities of hens nesting in these, I'll just call them hairy vetch, cereal rye, winter peas, crimson
Mm-hmm.
clover, and of course triticale. There's a whole plethora of species, but they like nesting in it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I have caught. This is where I'm looking to you guys to hopefully do some research on this. I have caught poults and hens coming out of it, so I know they're going in it. I look at it kind of like a quail guy. I did some work with down there with Dr. Berger and his grad students. How in the world is a quail chick going to get through some of this? I mean, what I'm sitting in here now, I have a base of a perennial clover down here with some chicory and plantain, and then I have kind of this mid-story of crimson clover. Um, there are some winter peas and a couple other annual clovers and biennials, and then obviously hairy vetch, the trit, the barley, the wheat, the rye, all that stuff. But it doesn't look structurally perfect to me for poults and quail chicks to move around in. Again,
Mm-hmm.
having said that, I have caught them coming out of it. You would never see them in it because it's so
Right.
Mm-hmm.
dense. Does this mean that we're going to do this to the entire property? Absolutely not. And I think this is where the conversation, maybe every research paper ends with we need more research on this area. This is what I would throw back to you guys is help us figure out really, what the difference is in structure and how that impacts what hens choose for nesting, brood rearing, loafing, etc. I can tell you um, that we have had to actually we've actually adapted to this and used, we call this squatchy, meaning Sasquatch habitat back here.
Mm-hmm.
We've taken some of our more squatchy blends and actually left them stand. You were talking about roller crimpers, crimp termination, crimp timing. That's a whole other topic. Um, we've actually adapted and left some of these stand longer than what the agricultural context would because we don't want to get in there and obviously roll over the hens. Now, I personally believe there's a net gain here, even if you crush a couple of, nests. That hurts my feelings just to say that. I know you
Yeah.
guys have talked about, taking out some nests and hens, with prescribed fire. I guess that collateral damage may be a part of this. There comes a time where I have to get out here and I'll mow my ragweed cover crop plot or I'll roller crimp the one I'm sitting in. And I just, I go slow. I hope to God I don't run one over, but I think the net gain at the end of the day, as long as you don't do all of your open food plots in this one, and that's not
Right.
even a part of our management anyway, right? So we
Yeah.
would minimize, I think, our losses by diversifying, as you mentioned. But I will tell you, I've noticed the poults in the wheat fields next door a fair amount. Now, that particular hen, I think, is now poultless. She was down to 3 when we were turkey hunting, and now I don't think she's got any with her. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, the overhead cover is great. The insect attraction that a plot like you're sitting in right now would be great. It's just are we too dense at ground level, and maybe figuring out like is it just like a seed population reduction thing, or or what,
Yeah,
but
I heard
I
you
think that's
say
going
that.
to,
I don't
yeah,
know if that. I'm game to try anything. I don't know if that's going to work because obviously we're trying to go super dense on our cover crops, our smother crops, so that
sure,
we can suppress the weeds.
sure.
Maybe fire on some sort of return interval would be the answer for bird breeding habitat. Man, I'm super. This excites me because when you
Mm.
figure it out, or when we figure it out, that property 300 yards to my
Mhm.
north is going to see it. I mean,
Hmm.
that's what we're going to do. But yeah, from an insect standpoint, I can tell you this too. In regenerative agriculture, soil health, when we improve the health and fitness of a plant, the insect pressure goes down to nothing. And I've got clients all over the country who say, Jay, you're not going to believe this. My neighbor has no soybeans left, but when I go in my summer nourishment or summer reload, my soybeans have no insect pressure at all. And,
Hmm.
I don't know if you guys have used a refractometer or not, but I use my refractometer looking at bricks, which is basically the sap of the plant. They use it in the wine industry, the honey industry, et cetera. And it amazes me when I started off, I was at like 4 or 5 bricks. This is just a reading. You hold it up to the light of dissolved solids, but I'm now up to 9, 10 on some of the not so great fields, and I've finally broke that. Not that there's a rule of thumb, but sort of the goal with bricks is 12, 13. And when you get there, the report from entomologists and production ag people is that the insect pressure is virtually non-existent because the insects will jump on a plant that's that healthy, bite it, and that's not what they want. Insects are there to take out the weak, just like predators, right? Wolves, coyotes, generally they take out the weak, generally speaking. So, that's one thing I've noticed is as my bricks levels have slowly increased, my insect pressure has gone down. We used to fly. I had a video on YouTube called Death from Above. It makes me sick to my stomach now to think about it, where I had a local guy fly this and spray, I think it was Mustang Max, because I had beetles on my monoculture forward soybeans. Well, I haven't seen one of those beetles in years. And I hear that from other clients too, is that the insect pressure is non-existent. Now, again, we're not spraying insecticides. We're planting naked, right? We're planting naked seeds that are not coated with, anything, especially neonicotinoids. So I think I know we have increased the number of beneficial insects, predatory insects, and we've
Hmm.
allowed that population to get back into balance where those beneficial insects are now consuming at an acceptable rate, apparently, those pest insects. So just something to think about that, generally the grasshoppers, the larger um, insects, arthropods, I guess would be the right thing, Marcus. They like that, bricks of 10-ish, 10 to 11. And, the smaller insects seem to like that 2, 3, 4, 5. So if we can create a biologically robust soil and grow these nutrient dense forages, it hurts my feelings, man, when I listen to some of these, especially the Southern podcasts, when they're talking about going out there and preemptively nuking armyworms. It blows my mind because that's the reason we have armyworms, the monocultures and the sides that have taken out the beneficials along with the relatively few pests. If we grow a healthier plant, the pests will go to the neighbor.
Hmm. Well, I do have some, we'll call it impending research with Pulse that I want to look at field management stuff and how people can do that. And one, I do have an interest in this, so hopefully we'll be able to directly address some of this. I found it interesting. A few of the comments, people, uh, I would just say, frankly, were rude about the insects and why turkeys would obviously love all of this, and we're kind of, I guess, speaking to our scrutiny of it when we were trying to think of all the different ways that we might manage fields and how that might affect turkeys. But
Well,
the
it's
one that
interesting. And
people
I'm always
said
willing
was
to
that,
point this out, but as you create a higher healthier plant, we may get rid of the insects altogether. I don't know. I have a feeling it'll
It's,
just shift the profile, but
yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I kind of uh, feel like that's probably what you'll see is you'll see a shift in the insects and maybe an increase in diversity and
I've got one climbing on
abundance.
my camera right now that I don't. It looks like it's from outer space. I mean, it's there's some pretty neat insects
Yeah.
moving around down here. I've never seen it. I grew up in this county.
Well, but that that goes back, I guess, to the same thing. Uh, I want to see that done in a rigorous study. Like I want to see how does insect populations as it relates to turkeys respond to this, and then how do turkeys respond to that?
I do a lot of citizen science. I pull poop samples from every state where there's whitetails that I'm walking and send them out. And I realize that's only one critter, one snapshot in time. But back when I had to forage soybeans, to your point earlier about just the number of genera on that report, I thought it was going to be easy. I'd make a sexy pie chart and, oh wow, they eat forbs, they eat this. I'll never forget. The number one species was Suga canadensis. The number two was Japanese knotweed, which is in a bottomland of mine that I personally love because it's medicinal, antimicrobial. We use it for Lyme disease, etc. My local conservation district wanted me to use a $60,000 grant to spray chemical in a riparian zone, which blew my mind. I refused. They did it to their side. Their side's eroding. My side looks amazing. Again, to the point on looking at that deer poop, I had these forage soybeans that were bigger than my hands, and it took us a while to get down to soybeans. I'll never forget. I had a small clover. I forget the species right now, Arians or something like that. That I had to Google it, and it showed up on Google, and it had a leaf size smaller than my pinky fingernail, and it had a yellow globe, like a golden globe flower, and it was called um, yellow hop clover, golden hop clover, golden glow. There's several common names. I had never seen this clover before, guys. Never. I was mowing the grass a couple weeks later, and I happened to look down at all these little golden globes. I jumped off the zero turn, pulled the plant, and here I was just overlooking it my entire life. And it was showing up in that poop sample more than our clovers in a bag. Now, as a guy who owns a seed company, I don't own a seed company to get wealthy. I own it because I was frustrated with what was going on in the seed industry. It blew my mind that we're planting all these sexy clovers. I pulled a couple here; they're kind of dying, but I mean, obviously, I've had pictures of clover leaves that were as big as my hand, and we still have them down here. But they're going after this tiny little yellow hop clover or whatever it's called. To me, that's mind blowing, right? You want to talk about preference. If you have all this, in front of you, but you are seeking out a specific tiny little clover down there, they're trying to tell us something right there.
Yeah.
Interesting stuff.
Yeah, it is. And I think the cool thing about it is there's so much, the more you explore it, the more there is. And I've made comments about academicians. Obviously, some of my closest friends have their PhD. That was my path. One of my closest friends said, "You know what PhD stands for? Poor, helpless, and destitute." I don't know about that, but I think the reason that the follow-up podcast pleases me is because I think it was needed. I don't think I enjoyed that first podcast. I wish more mainstream people would talk about it in that context. Like, hey, let's brainstorm here. How does this structure of Jason's fall nourishment? It's super dense down here, and I do have a lot of ragweed. How does that impact poles? I'm the first guy to be interested in that, not because of my properties, but because my clients are interested in the same thing. I think we need to have those discussions, continue to innovate, and understand that just because it's important to me doesn't mean it's important to Will, right? So it's our job to listen to the landowners' wishes, their goals, their expectations. And man, I'm here to tell you, threshold is a big one. Like your ability to look at a quote unquote dirty food plot. I have some clients that if there was a pharmaceutical that they could take that would help them see it differently, they would do it because being in this generation and transforming from the monoculture, pretty looking soybeans. I mean, there were times where I sit when my kids were infants, my driveway's over that way. I would jump out of the truck to go out and pull weed out of my monoculture soybeans or corn as they were growing because it was like the contractor's house, right? If a client comes to my house to see what I'm doing or talk about whatever, God forbid he sees a weed in my soybeans. But now, um, my happy meter is pretty well spiked in this field right now. I can tell you that.
Yeah, that's definitely always a challenge. Marcus and I oftentimes are not necessarily trying to recalibrate somebody's perspective around, regen ag, but rather just we recommend a lot of fallow field management for native plants, and the same thing kind of factors in. But I agree with you. I think there's a lot of upshot to what you're doing,
Yeah.
and I think it's just trying to figure out and better understand um, what are the opportunities for wildlife, and what are, potentially some negative aspects that it might have in terms of use current under the way that it's typically practiced, and how can we, adjust prescriptions
Mm-hmm.
to try to mitigate some of that too. It's all just objective driven and trying to figure out how to make things work together to achieve the desired outcome.
Yeah. I'd say you guys have your hands full.
There's no lack of questions and need, so
Yeah.
that's
That's right.
good.
Yeah. But I would encourage you guys as turkey guys to look at the systemic impact of having neonic wrapped soybeans. And I know
I've
it
I've got
concerns
I've
me.
got that data right now.
Yeah,
I've got
those data are frightening. And I know with
yeah.
my honeybees that thrive in an area that honeybees, I mean, my splits go to people in my neighborhood because they see massive losses die back every year of their colonies. I'm here to tell you our elimination of the synthetics and obviously the neonics, I think has been, and interestingly, when my neighbor farmer decided to plant those soybeans with the neonic on them, I immediately got concerned. My first beekeeper passed away unexpectedly. Unfortunately, he was an older guy, had bee kept for 40 years, and made some comments I would love people to hear him say, that he had seen things happen here that just don't happen anywhere else he beekeeps in our area. But um, I think that bees too have a nutritional wisdom, right? Bees are not native. We're always hammering on non-natives. I love honey. I take it every morning. It's medicinal, and I firmly believe that those bees are going to have, some nutritional wisdom, and they're going to forage to the south because they know to the north there is something not so good up there. So it's this is the fun part of citizen science and this whole regenerative soil health. But again, I would urge people never to greenwash the term and say, hey, I'm regenerative, I'm not. I think we need to, if we're taking steps, in the right direction. Take a farmer I know, for instance, who used the Haney health test to save $250,000 on his operation. Big operation, yes, but if you don't think 250,000 in cutting back inputs means a broader margin for that farmer, and you don't know much about the margins in farming. So, some of these guys, these farmers are not cutting synthetics out altogether. I can't fault them for that. But I think if you go from 250 units of N to 120, I think we've made a big stride in a few years. And their goals are obviously to eliminate it at some point. So I think as long as we're restoring ecosystem function and we're working towards that process, I think you're regenerative. To be honest with you, um, your regenerative is probably not my regenerative. That might be another T-shirt, but I think that's okay, right? I think that's the way it should be.
Yeah, I think as soon as you start always establishing that it has to be this way, you're gonna get reduced buy-in versus if you try to build in some flexibility so people can, pick what they want to do and what they don't want to do, at least starting out especially, right? And start experimenting with those and then see where it leads.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. And the one thing too, I heard somebody said on the podcast, there's not a lot of testing for soil health, and in this regen approach, Dr. Rick Haney has just totally revolutionized. I mean, it's just mind blowing what he's done. So the Haney soil health test is uh, is what we use now. The conventional test does not fit this anymore. That's for when you want to constantly spoon feed. It's an if then test. If this happens, then go buy this much fertilizer. Works really good for the fertilizer salesman and the chemical companies. So the Haney test, PLFA, phospholipid fatty acids, is really good if you want to drill down on the composition of these functional groups, as you guys mentioned. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa. The protozoa are the predators. I love predators personally. I love watching in nature. I love watching predators perform their duty. Um, I've really enjoyed seeing my protozoans increase over time. And I know this is nerdy and something that the people at the local graduation party won't want to hear, but it's been difficult to get them back. I'm just throwing that out there. And I know others have seen that. It's been very difficult to get the predators back. And I suspect it's because, as Aldo and Bruce Leopold said, you've got to have prey and predators to have a functioning ecosystem. You just have to.
Mm.
And the roller crimper, I'll throw this out there, only certain plants successfully crimp terminate. Okay.
Hmm.
And then timing plays a massive role in the level of effectiveness and that you get in a crimp term. I personally, I don't care if I get a 30%, 40%, 50% crimp term. A farmer growing a grain to make money on probably wants 100%. I personally want a different percentage every time. I don't want to ever I want planned, purposeful disruptions. I don't want to do the same thing in nature every time because nature never does that. So the roller crimper timing is crucial. The more complex you get with diversity, like you see behind me, it's more complex it gets to successfully crimp terminate. Um, but again, we're adapting to that, and if a plant pops up, maybe that plant's meant to be there.
Well, Jason, I know we've been going on for nearly 2 hours now, and it's been really fascinating. Is there anything that we're missing or take-home message that you think you'd like to
Two things,
express?
I guess two things. We hammered everything else. Number one, we need to focus on the biology underground because everything above ground is a function of what's going on down there, just like in your gut. If you destroy your gut, your immune system's in the tank and you're in trouble. The other thing I would say, I'm going to wrap it up with this. The beauty of this system is biomimicry and farming in nature's image can be done by anybody. I've got two drills sitting in this barn 200 yards to the south of me. Two, a John Deere and a Great Plains. I could do this without either of those drills. And quite frankly, I use the cheapest one most often. I've got a tractor sitting in there that I really probably don't need. Um, you could mimic nature at a very small scale if you're willing to do two things. Use this and adjust your expectations, right? If you're looking for a monoculture, pretty stand you're gonna be proud of to snap on the Facebook page, that's probably not gonna happen. But if you're looking to restore ecosystem function and make your fields actually attractive to everything from insects to birds to wildlife, whatever, it can be done with a four-wheeler, a broadcast spreader, and honestly, just a lot of patience. So I think that's a beautiful thing. Nature doesn't send a drill out here. Nature doesn't plow, disc, lime, fertilize, build multi-species blends. She doesn't do any of that. So I hear that a lot. Oh, you've got to have roller crimpers now because the material they start at $5,000 on up. We just shipped a 10-footer to South Carolina this morning. I think that was over $9,000, right? So they're expensive. Drills are expensive. Tractors are expensive. Diesel's expensive. But I've got guys who have grown regenerative food plots, focusing more on soil health, that are mind-blowing. They'll plant heavy cereal rye, roll it down with four-wheeler. In South Africa, I saw them using a Honda Civic, rather comical. But the point is, you can run over with the pickup truck if you have to.
Yeah.
And get your seeds in there and let nature take on the rest. So that's one thing I want to point out is this is not a rich man sport. Now, hey, dude, are the toys fun? Absolutely. I have barns full of them, but you don't need them. And then, sometimes, honestly, if you're not fixing, you're not farming, they say. So sometimes the tools make me want to quit because they break for me all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we appreciate your time, Jason.
Yeah, I do want to just wrap that up with that. And I want to thank you guys and say, hey, thanks for doing this great work. I mean, the work you guys do, I'm a huge fan of both of you. I wish Bronson was on this with us, but obviously he's busy. But man, keep up the good work. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we appreciate the time. Great.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Great content.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks everybody out there for listening. We appreciate all the feedback. And again, the popular demand was to continue to talk about this, and here we are again. So keep giving us that feedback. We appreciate it. And if you hadn't rated the podcast, we'd appreciate it if you could take a moment to do that. So appreciate it, guys.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.